Welcome into Talkin Ducks. Oregon gets the big win over Michigan. I'm going to do my best to save my voice for this entire episode. Fortunately, we've got a wonderful panel joining us. We'll get to them in just a moment. We'll preview Oregon's matchup against Maryland. We'll discuss whether or not Oregon has had the easiest slate of games in their inaugural season in the Big Ten, and let you know where else this team can get a lot better, especially in the third quarter, plus some injury news for Tez Johnson and Marcus Harper as well, too. But let's go ahead and introduce the guys that'll do the majority of the talking this episode. We've got Aaron Fentress, always fair and balanced. We've got George Reister joining us again for a handful of segments. And Joey Harrington, fresh off his colonoscopy. How's it going, buddy? You doing all right? You doing good after that?
Okay, look, let's be honest here, okay? Number one, everybody, every male, man, woman, everybody should, over the age of 45, get it done, right? That's the line.
You're 45 already?
I'm 46. I'm old, dude.
Damn, you're old.
Okay, but if not for, finding early signs of cancer and for your health, but do it because you lose 5 pounds the day before and you get the best midday nap that you'll ever have. It's like, you fall asleep at like 11 and then it's like 5 o'clock and what happened? It's like, sweet. So, little cost benefit analysis, got a big nap, lost a couple pounds, didn't have to talk to Fentress for a while. I'd say it was a pretty good deal.
Yeah, definitely sign me up for that. Well, Joey, while you were gone enjoying your nap this weekend, let's start with you because I know you had a chance to digest this, my man. Oregon goes into Michigan, and here we are. It's almost nonchalantly a 3-score victory over the Michigan Wolverines, the defending national champions. Say what you want about Michigan, their quarterback issues this season, but Oregon goes on the road in another powerhouse game against one of the names in college football, and they just dominate this game, Joey, and week after week, here we go. We're seeing more and more about this Oregon team that continues to be positive.
Yes, I would say yes-ish. You always want to win, period, plain and simple. I don't think I think it also is fair to say that this isn't really surprising. Number one, because this is a really good Oregon football team. And two, we had Ohio State, but really, like Illinois, good team. Michigan, kind of good team. It's not like we're playing Penn State and Ohio State and Indiana every single weekend, right? I mean, this was similar to kind of how it was when Marcus was in the pack, and we'd have Stanford one week, and then you'd have like a few weeks where you just kind of expected to roll. Look, there are, pick 6 teams that really have a legit shot to win this whole thing, this new tournament that we're looking at. And I will also come back to the point that college football really doesn't start until mid-November, right? That's I know it was November 1st, November 2nd, whenever they technically played at Michigan. There's something about it that just didn't quite feel, there wasn't the pressure. You give it a couple weeks now to go to Camp Randall in, Wisconsin. It's going to be ugly. It's going to be late in the season. You're going to have that burden of being, number one team in the country. Everybody's trying to knock you off. There's still a little bit of, all right, cool, that exists for me at this point in the season because you don't have those dire consequences. That being said, Oregon's really good. I expected them to be really good. I'm not sure what else to say other than they're a pretty dang good football team. And, we're going to see these kind of games, I think, until we really start getting into late November.
George, your thoughts?
I would agree with Joey is that the pressure has not started to mount because in our 2001 season, up until that Stanford game, you're winning football games, everything's good, but that pressure starts to mount on the team and you start to feel that zero. You start to feel that undefeated record. You start, right? But that's a lot of it is on the coaching staff. And there's a hard time. People have more trouble dealing with success than they do failure because when you're not in first place, it's easy to see the guy in first place and say, okay, I got to run faster to catch that person. But once you catch and overtake them, you become the unanimous number one team in the country. How fast do you need to run to continue to pace yourself the way you don't burn yourself out, but also the way you keep your lead and you keep getting better and you keep putting yourself in a good position to be better throughout the season. And I think that that's the part where the experience that Dan Lanning has had at Georgia, at Alabama, in national championship seasons, I think that now is the time where you're actually seeing those dividends being paid.
And Jordan, I'm gonna jump back in here before Fentress goes completely and takes it off the rails, because that's what he likes to do. I agree with Georgia's point in that, like, we saw what happened to Alabama after they had they had a big win and then lost to Vanderbilt. I can't remember who they
Georgia and then lost to Vanderbilt.
Oh, they beat Georgia. That's who it was, right? That's why Nick Saban was. Hold on, no. Let me make my point. Then we'll get to this. I had a chance to play for Nick Saban. This is why he was so good, because he could manufacture motivation when there truly wasn't any. He could scare the hell out of you as a player to think, oh my God, if I don't do more than I did last week, the entire world is gonna collapse, and my parents' house is gonna be repossessed, and I'm probably gonna have cancer and have another colonoscopy. Like, he could just create this world that motivated you beyond belief when there was really nothing there. Like, you look at it, it's like, well, Alabama, they're the best team in the country. But if you ask their players, it's like, oh my God, the world is caving in. That's what Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoi have been able to do at Oregon and keep them motivated and performing at this level that we have come to expect. I mean, we saw Kalen DeBoer. Alabama isn't great because of simply being Alabama. They were great because of the coaches behind them. And that's part of, I think, why we've come to expect this level, is because our coaches have done such a fantastic job. Go ahead, Fentress, undercut everything.
I'm just still taken aback that you said you'd rather have a colonoscopy than talk to me for an hour.
It was a good nap.
Expected something like that on this fine Monday afternoon. Look, first of all, props to George. I don't say this often, but I got to give George props. He had 38-16. It was 38 or 37. Shoot, I can't remember. 37-17. What was it? 38?
38-17.
So you're off by 1 point. That's very impressive. That's difficult to do. I mean, you got lucky, but that's okay. As far as the game itself, I mean, it went pretty much the way I think we all thought it would. I mean, Oregon's superior. The main place they're superior is in the pocket. My God, how does Michigan not have a competent quarterback? Not even great, just so incompetent after winning the national title. And the only reason why, Michigan got their first touchdown, we all know, is because of a fumbled punt return. So this was in a 2024 Oregon-style beatdown. It was pretty much over at half. We're going to talk about the third quarter situation, but I come away from this game feeling exactly as I felt going into it, that this is a really good football team that's taking care of business against mediocre opponents.
Yeah, it's interesting because at the end of the day, it's still a win over Michigan.
At Michigan.
I get it. In the grand scheme of things of the season, football doesn't start until mid-November, but you're beating a blue blood program, which does add some stock to Oregon and this brand. But I do want to get to that here in a second. We are going to step aside, take a quick break. When we come back, though, we'll talk about Tez Johnson. We'll talk about Marcus Harper. We'll get to some more thoughts on this game as well, too. Oregon, though, crushing Michigan. How much of a loss did they take in the health department? We'll let you know when we come back on Talkin Ducks. Welcome back to Talkin Ducks. Oregon getting the victory over Michigan on the road by 3 scores. Before we get to the injuries, though, George, you had a point you wanted to make because we were talking about this win against the blue blood program, Oregon doing what they're supposed to. You wanted to tag along with that.
Yeah, it's that you still literally have to go on the road, because we've seen teams like when Alabama went to go play Vanderbilt. They lost to Vanderbilt on the road because they were unprepared for that environment. They were unprepared for the energy and everything else that came with it. And yes, Oregon was supposed to roll in their game as a double touchdown favorite, but it is still like you have to go on the road. You have to perform. And we've seen so many teams this year that have been unprepared on the road when they do have to travel. And that ups the stakes so much more, even if it's not, an Ohio State or a Indiana or, Penn State sitting in front of you.
And that's the thing. At the end of the day, you get the road victory, and it's by 3 scores against a team that won a national championship. Say what you will about the quarterback, but they still have some of those pieces. However, Oregon might be missing some pieces, some injuries to Tez Johnson and Marcus Harper. I'm going to lose all 3 of you here for a second. Tez Johnson posted on his Instagram a picture of Goku from Dragon Ball Z in a hyperbaric recovery chamber. If you watch this anime like I did religiously in high school and didn't have friends and didn't get invited to dates, Goku comes back later in the series and wrecks shop on everybody. I don't think he's posting this if he's done for the year. So that tells me Tez Johnson, before the injury news comes out, he's going to be back at some point this season stronger than ever. Now, Marcus Harper, that injury might be a little bit more significant. There were no anime posts to give me a lead on that one. But let's start with Tez Johnson in the short term here, Aaron Fentress. What does it mean if Tez Johnson is not in the game the next couple of weeks here?
My generation would have posted Luke floating in that water being treated in Empire Strikes Back. You can tell that the generational difference is there.
Never seen that either.
You've never seen Empire Strikes Back?
No. Dude, I've never seen Star Wars
I'm
in my
deleting
life.
you from my
Man,
friends.
how can we
Block on
uninvite?
social media.
Isn't
That's
George's show called The Uninvited Show? Isn't that like?
What? What'd you say, Joey?
I said, isn't George's show called The Uninvited Show? Like, can't we uninvite him off of like our show for not? How do you not see Star Wars? That's like saying like I've never listened to Thriller. Like there's a different like. Okay, we go somewhere.
All my kids have watched it, and they tried to get me to watch it, but I wanted to watch it in chronological order, and they were like, "No, you got to watch this first." And so we didn't end up watching.
Okay, that's a shame. Anyway, back to Tez. That's huge. He has more receptions than the next 2 guys combined. We have 8 touchdowns, something like that. And he's their go-to security blanket dude who can take a short pass and take it to the house. That's a huge loss for them. It's good to know that he may not be out for the season, which is great. He could be back for the playoffs. But I think that's something that could not hurt them the next 3 weeks. I really don't think they're going to have much trouble winning the next 3 weeks. But if he's not there against maybe Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game, that could be a problem.
Boom. Aaron, you literally just contradicted yourself.
How?
The answer is, over the next month, it is no deal. This is no big deal at all. Tez is an amazing player, but this wide receiver room is like the D-line room. This is a place where you can fade a little bit of injuries. So now, at the same time, next man up policy says that this could actually be a positive because Tez is so amazing that now you're going to get a chance to see more of Justice Lowe. You're going to get a chance to see more of Trayshawn. We might see a Jurion Dickey sighting. We might see Clemens. Anybody who's going to get a chance to step up and get some experience, who may have to be special during the college football playoff run. And now, is Tez being out going to cost Oregon one of the next 3 games? Absolutely not. So that's why I say it's not a big deal, but having him back potentially for the Big Ten championship and for the college football playoff run, that is significant.
How did I contradict myself? I basically said that, but I said,
you said it's a big deal. And then you said, actually, it's not
No,
over the next
I
3
said-
weeks. Because it's not a big deal.
The next 3
over the
weeks-
next month. It's not.
they don't have him in the Big Ten championship game, which is what I said. That would be a big deal.
That's 5 weeks away.
Jordan, is this what you guys have been dealing with? Like, I may go back and
This
have
is
another
what we've been doing
colonoscopy.
since you've been gone, Joey.
Are you saying he's going to be back by the
Joey,
Big Ten
let's get
championship
to
game?
you with Marcus Harper,
I
though, on the
suspect
offensive
he'll be
line.
back.
You suspect, but if he's
Fine.
not,
I suspect.
that could be a problem. If he's not, that could be a problem.
Yes.
That's all I said.
Either way, I think Oregon needs as many possible weapons on the field in this Big Ten title game. But Joey, offensive line, though, Marcus Harper, he's the most experienced member of this offensive line. You can make the argument that Oregon started playing their best football when they solidified the rotations on that offensive line. Marcus Harper, again, we don't have the official word, but let's just say it is a longer amount of time than it is with Tez Johnson. That, to me, seems to be a much bigger blow.
Yeah, the Oregon team we saw the first 2 weeks when they were having issues at the up front is different than the Oregon team that we've seen over the last month and a half. Now I don't know how much of that was specifically linked to the center position, but God, anytime you lose a guy like this, it could be big. I mean, I I don't know. I hesitate to make too big of a deal about it because, this is what recruiting is for, right? You recruit these talented players to come in and take the place of somebody who's an established starter. Someone's got to take over eventually, right? But we saw what happened when this offensive line was a little bit in flux at the beginning of the year, and I don't like the potential idea of that coming back, especially as we get later into the season when we're going to have to rely on this offensive line to go in and run the football in places like Madison, Wisconsin. Like this is something that needs to be addressed and needs to be addressed quickly.
Oregon loses that Ohio State game if Harper and Tiz aren't playing. If both are not there at the Big Ten championship against Ohio State, that game's an L. Just letting you know right now.
Stop it. We can't foresee the future.
I said if.
Hey, we're not accepting your negativity around here. But on the offensive line, I got a name for you. David Iuli. That's a name that you guys can look at potentially to get an opportunity at the guard position, or whether they're going to shuffle guard and center around, because he had been hurt coming into the beginning of the year. So if he's healthy, that's a name that we could look to see a little bit more.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see the length of these injuries as we try to hear more about it. But at least for the next 3 weeks, Oregon should be able to get these victories without these two members. But once you get to Big Ten title game, it becomes a lot more up in the air, especially depending on who Oregon plays. Keep in mind, it's not a lock that Ohio State's going to play in that game quite yet. All right, stick around. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more. Oregon, unanimous #1 team in the nation. Have they been the most consistent? We'll let you know when we come back on Talkin Ducks. Welcome back to Talkin Ducks, and for another week in the AP poll, the Oregon Ducks are #1. This time around, unanimous #1, and feels pretty surreal to say that here, George, because you've looked at how Alabama and Georgia and Clemson have dominated college football over the last 7-8 years, and now here we are, somewhat deep in the season in November, and Oregon is the #1 unanimous team. Do you feel like they've been the most consistent team in all of college football as you kind of look at the landscape here?
I mean, you would have to say yes, right? Is that they've been ascending throughout the season. They've continued to get better. Where the first 2 weeks a little bit sketch, yeah, sure, right? But since then, there has been a level of consistency and a level of improvement that you've continued to see. So it feels good to be the #1 team, unanimous and everything else. But remember what we talked about with Joey about that pressure mounting. As a fan and somebody who loves the program and as an analyst, it scares me a little bit because I just want to wrap the entire team up in bubble wrap. Don't send them to school. Don't send them outside in the cold without a jacket. Don't let appendix ruptures. Nothing, man. I mean, because Dennis Dixon's knee just like screams in my mind and it gives me nightmares. So this is why now I see what's going on, but I also am going to remain cautiously optimistic because I know that there's only 3 games left, but that's like having 32 games. I remember I told my son when he was a junior, starting his junior year, headed to try to go play college football. I said, son, you are 90% of the way to be a college football quarterback, 90% of the way. But the last 10% is all uphill, though. It is all uphill. It is harder than the 90%. And that's where the Oregon Ducks are right now. This last 10% of the season is straight uphill.
Joey.
Ask me about being #1.
Joey, with the season not finished yet and the most important game still over a month away, how important is it that the Oregon Ducks are #1 right now, and do they get a trophy for that?
Gotcha. Who cares? Doesn't matter. I don't care. It doesn't. I get it. Like, it's nice. Oh, we're #1. Who cares?
Well, I will ask you another question on top of that, Joey.
Okay.
Oregon's 1 undefeated. What if they were 8 with 1 loss? Would that matter the same or matter less? Because now you're talking top 12 teams getting the playoff. If you're #1, you can afford a loss late into the season. Unless you're 8, 9, or 10, you really can't take that L in November and feel like you can get into the playoff.
Yeah, Joey.
Ooh, that is
Care now, Joey?
that is the first legitimate argument that I have actually heard to validate being number one in the country right now. Like there is a little bit to that, but I would say in the same way that, but does that really?
Indiana wishes they were number one right now. I'll tell you that much.
Okay, come back to me next segment. Let me think about this.
Aaron, please. Oh, stumped the quiz master. All right, Aaron.
To Joey's point that he can't really conjure up right now, it does have meaning to be the number one seed, but right now being number one doesn't necessarily matter because that could be tripped up in the next few weeks, right? I think that's what Joey's kind of getting to. I don't see it happening the next 3 weeks. Maryland, I think that game's going to be just like the Illinois game. Wisconsin just got throttled by Iowa. And Washington, I think Washington brings some fire into that game. They just don't have the dogs, so to speak, to handle Oregon, especially in Austin. But I will say this, what's funny about it, though, is that we're talking about one change, maybe the offensive pass interference, which was a legit call. If that's changed and Ohio State kicks a field goal, Ducks are 4 or 5 now. Ohio State's number one. That's how precarious it is.
Oh, my God, you sound like Lincoln Riley right now.
No, let him finish, George. Let him finish.
George,
let him finish.
Let me finish. So, but still, you'd have to win out to get into the Big Ten title game, which is where it's going to matter, where I think they're going to play Ohio State. But to you, George, last week you were talking about if they played Boise today, they'd win by 3 touchdowns, discounting what happened. But when I bring up an if, then it's, I'm Lincoln Riley now. Don't be a hypocrite, man. You know how precarious it is. And my point is that to Joey's point, being ranked number one is not going to matter when they get in the playoffs and there's like 6 or 7 teams that can beat them. That's what I think the overall point is.
George, the floor is yours, my friend.
This is where we have reached, right? And this is a positive and a negative, is that Oregon's playing so well that Aaron is searching, just trying to find any grasping of straws of something negative to try to find, right? And if there is anything negative to find about this team, it is the third quarter. Like, that's it. But it has not been an issue throughout the entire season in terms of wins and losses. And it is important to be where your feet are and to continue to get better and continue to moving in the right direction the way you are playing your best football when the playoff comes.
Joey, has your rook taken bishop yet?
Not yet. Are we done yet? Are we still?
Yeah, we're done.
Yeah, who keeps inviting George onto the show? Can we have a talk with that person?
Either way, I will say this. If you swap situations and let's say Oregon's sitting where Indiana is at 8 or 9 and you lose that Big Ten title game, you might not be in the top 12 and you might not get a playoff spot. And I think the most important thing is...
No way 12-1 in the Big Ten doesn't get in. No way.
You say that one more time, Aaron?
There's no way a 12-1 team would not get in.
No, I agree with you there, but at the same time, see, everybody looks at the number one thing as being a big deal in terms of, we're number one right now. No, that you got to think about the big picture of it. Being number one, consensus number one, unanimous number one. That's a level of respect that you have gotten from the voters. And if you're getting that from the AP voters, you're going to get the benefit of the doubt when it comes to the football playoff committee voters, and not necessarily this year because you won't need it. This is for future years when Oregon is 10, 11, 12, 8, 9, 10, and that conversation is that, man, you can't leave Oregon out of the playoff. The same way that they're going to be trying to shoehorn Alabama in, that's what you want, and that's the reason why this number one ranking matters right now.
Preach, George Reister. All right, George. It's been a pleasure, my man. Thanks for joining us for 3 segments. We're going to have Dan Rubenstein join us next segment. We'll talk a little bit more about this Big Ten big picture as well. Stick around, plenty more Talkin Ducks when we come back. Welcome back into Talkin Ducks. Yes, my voice is still gone, but fortunately we welcome in another voice from the Solid Verbal podcast. We've got Dan Rubenstein joining us. And Dan, listen, unlike us schlubs here, you actually went to the big house to take this game in. You drank in all 4 quarters. Tell me your thoughts, your experiences. You see Oregon in person. Was it any different than watching them on the big screen?
It was, just because you can physically see Oregon against another team built similarly in person, and Oregon was, for the most part, bigger, faster, more aggressive, covering more ground, everything you'd want a number 1 team, Oregon or otherwise, to be. So yes, the speed was on display. Even from above, you could see Michigan players, and some of the backups were in the secondary, they were not closing space in the same way that you would want if you were going to compete against Oregon. And it was something that added to the experience, something to behold.
And what do you make about Oregon at this point? I mean, we just got done discussing the fact that they're the unanimous number 1. They go on the road and they get a victory. And even though Michigan's down a quarterback this year, I get it, you still beat Michigan in their house by 3 scores. And that's got to mean something here.
Yeah, and they also beat the team that might have the best defensive tackle duo in the nation. And while the running game wasn't electric, it was creative enough. They were able to generate big enough plays at opportune moments that it was able to sort of cancel out that advantage. And that's even with Oregon losing a starting guard late in the game. It seemed that even when Michigan was able to generate pressure, Dylan Gabriel was able to move around and make plays. We saw obviously the called back touchdown where he was scrambling and hit a receiver in the back of the end zone. I think it was Evan Stewart. That it ultimately, Oregon was able to game plan around that, and whatever push they got didn't make a huge difference up front.
You know, that's an interesting point. Like, for all those years where Oregon was, you know, the flashiest, the best, oh my God, they're going to win a national championship with Marcus, or they're, you know, LaMichael James. And I remember the kryptonite was always a defensive lineman, right? The kryptonite was always Nick Fairley, right? How good you can be the best team in the entire country, and then all of a sudden you run up against one of those teams that has a Nick Fairley in there, and your running game goes, and then, you know, with all of Chip's offenses, it was, you know, it was based off the ability to run the football. That's an interesting point that I hadn't really thought of. Like, if this truly is going to be a team that gets to where we all want and or think that they should, the ability to handle those interior alignment is going to be huge.
Yeah, you look at the teams at or near the top, and maybe with the exception of Miami, who's got good ends, but Texas is not where they were last year. Oregon has proven it's been able to succeed to whatever extent against Ohio State. Georgia obviously has monsters, but everything else is sort of TBD on. I mean, Oregon's remaining schedule isn't all that potent in terms of defensive linemen there, and whoever they might play in the play, like Notre Dame has very good defensive linemen. Penn State has good defensive linemen. There are a number of teams. Tennessee obviously has very good defensive linemen. So depending on the health of Marcus Harper these next few weeks, they're built pretty nicely to not dominate, but at least handle those types.
One last question for you, Dan, and I'll let Aaron get to any questions about the Big Ten or Ohio State and Penn State. Many people were comparing the fact that, listen, this is the big house, and they've been comparing crowd sizes and crowd noises. Autzen Stadium, half the size. How would you compare the noise level when the energy was at its highest in the first quarter versus some of these games you've been to at Autzen?
So to be fair, I was in the press box, and it's a closed press box.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm here to be authentic and honest, but I will compliment. I have compliments for the big house. It was a smart crowd that cheered at the right times, that gave everything they had, despite obviously it being a down year for Michigan coming off of a national championship. This is a smart, savvy fan base that obviously saw a little bit of blood in the water early when you have the muff punt for Oregon, and maybe it's going to be a little bit closer. They were engaged. They were not disaffected by the season. So I wasn't on the field, so I can't say, oh, like it's comparable or it's nothing like that. The stadium's not built like Autzen to sort of keep that noise in. It might be a little bit of an older grouping of fans as well. Michigan, the traditions there. It's not Autzen, but I mean, I think there was great electricity there for a huge matchup. Sure.
With election day tomorrow, very political answer. I appreciate that, Dan. All right, Aaron, I'll let you get to it, my friend.
I'm married to a Michigan alum.
Wait a minute. Wait. How is that not? Like, don't we have the conflict of interest here? Like, How is that?
I can tell you this: we have a Michigan flag and we have an Oregon flag, and only the yellow, the bright electric yellow one, is flying outside of our house.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
Is your couch comfy or?
You know, we have 2 little kids that she is an angel and watches them on Saturdays while I work. So she is not locked in. And I mean, 10 months ago, she got to watch her school win a national championship. Life is still good for her.
True.
Okay, so speaking of national championships, we talked earlier about the Ducks' path moving forward. I'm still of the mind that, there's like 8 teams that anyone could win out of that 8, including Oregon. I looked at ESPN's Power Index. They have Oregon actually 7th. They have Miami, which is undefeated. They have them 9th, I think. And of course, Indiana is way down at 10, which just shows that being undefeated, of course, according to the Power Indexes, doesn't mean all that much. But from your perspective, do you think Oregon has reached the point where they are the team to beat? Or do you still think, and I think you said this last time, that they're still amongst a group?
I think they're amongst a group. I think Oregon has shown that they might have the fewest questions. That every one of these teams in this conversation does at least one thing, 2 things extraordinarily well. We saw the best of Georgia up front against Texas. We've seen the best of Miami on offense especially. We've seen the best of Texas, albeit coming against some lower opponents, and obviously the Michigan win means a little bit less in retrospect. But we've seen a lot of these teams. Alabama has offensive pop. They're down there. Tennessee has the defensive front. I think they're leading the nation in points per drive allowed in this moment. So if you want to win a game 20-17, Tennessee might be that team. But in terms of a lack of questions and buttoning up the little things, I think in this moment, Oregon has the fewest questions of anybody, right? They haven't needed to sneak by Virginia Tech or Cal. They haven't needed to do a number of the things, like they didn't need to beat Kentucky by 1, like Georgia had to do. And they didn't lose to Kentucky like Ole Miss had to do, as great as that Ole Miss offense and pass rush is. So Oregon hasn't shown a vulnerability, at least since that Boise State game in Big Ten play, like some others have.
And it's interesting, you mentioned the Boise State game, and not to go back and harp on it, but, in retrospect, that game is looking more and more impressive, even though you win at the last second. It's against maybe the Heisman Trophy winner in your second week of the season, when every coach will tell you they're still trying to kind of figure out what this roster looks like in week 2.
Yeah, and Boise State is very much in contention to be a playoff team in this moment if they are able to win the Mountain West and look impressive doing it, and depending on what happens elsewhere in G5 conferences. And this wasn't Oregon's offensive line. This, nobody is who they are in week 1 or 2. Boise's improved. Oregon's improved. Pretty much everybody that had a ceiling to get to has improved. And so it was not a great performance by Oregon, but it seems a little bit more defensible in this moment. Sure.
All right.
How do you feel about Indiana? Do we have time for this?
We're going to get there when we get right back here in a second, Aaron, because we got to take a quick little break. I do want to ask about Oregon's runway when we return here, Dan, and also about Indiana and the rest of this Big Ten. So stick around. Dan will have all the answers for us when we come back. Welcome back to Talkin Ducks, and Dan Rubenstein continuing to join us for another segment here. Dan, before we get to Oregon's runway and their remaining schedule, I think a team that a lot of people might be sleeping on up until maybe last week, Indiana in the Big Ten. What do you make about the top of this conference now that we've seen Ohio State versus Penn State, Oregon versus Ohio State, obviously, and how things might shake out the next couple of weeks?
Indiana looks to be really, really good. And it comes with an asterisk that they have not played a probably good team on this schedule. And I think Washington they're pretty good, right? They beat Washington with their own backup quarterback by 14, and every team should be so lucky to beat a pretty good team with your backup quarterback by 14. But yes, you'd like to see, I think they have Michigan this week, Indiana does, and Ohio State the following week, if memory serves. Indiana's really good. They're taking care of business like a really good team should against lower competition. Their schedule has not been good. They haven't played good quarterbacks. And even while their own quarterback is recovering from a thumb injury, they rattle off, 47 straight against Michigan State this past week? They are as buttoned up as anybody, as long as you understand that the schedule has not been comparable. Because honestly, if you're Indiana, why are you scheduling up in the non-conference? Generally speaking, you're scheduling to get to a bowl game. And so Indiana's been just crushing it.
Yeah, one of the great stories in college football this season. Now, Oregon's remaining schedule, we were talking about the injuries to Tez Johnson, which just recently reported it's not going to be season ending. They expect him to be back at some point before the end of the year. No update on Marcus Harper. how much does that matter when you look at the remaining 4 weeks for Oregon, one of those weeks being a bye also?
Yeah, if this had happened in week 3, I would have told you it was a really big deal. Given that it's a Wisconsin team who's struggling, given it's a Maryland team who's below average, Washington's, I think, a tough team. But that game's in Autzen, and there's time to sort of figure out a receiver rotation. You know, you add work for Kenyon Sadiq, who's sort of like a big slot in this moment alongside Terrence Ferguson and Pat Herbert. Do you add work for one of the freshmen like Ryan Pelham or I think it's Jeremiah McClellan? And obviously you have Justice Lowe, who's been a plus at receiver. I think he started the Michigan game. And so they have options. They have size options. They have speed options. And I would never say that there's a good time for Oregon's probable best receiver and safety valve for Dylan Gabriel to go down. But if he is able to come back somewhere near full strength, this is not a stretch where he seems like he'll be needed as like an emergency 3rd and 7 safety valve.
So let me ask you this, though. If both of those guys miss, say, a Big Ten championship game rematch against Ohio State, how would you feel about that matchup without those two?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's how you feel about Ohio State not having the left side of their line intact and struggling to protect Will Howard, and it goes sort of both ways. I would actually be more worried as an Oregon person about the offensive line issues, just because Kawika Rogers, who was the one who stepped in, got pushed back by an All-American defensive tackle, 8 yards almost immediately. They have options to sort of figure out who that guy is in the coming weeks, but if there's a weak spot on an offensive line when you play Notre Dame, when you play Tennessee, when you play Georgia, because they'll make the playoff regardless. If they lose to Ohio State and go 12-1, they'll be a 5 or 6 seed, and it's not terribly worrying about where they end up. They'll play their first game in Autzen Stadium, which is pretty cool in its own way. It's not going to be pleasant on December 20th or whatever in Eugene, so that'll be fun, I guess, to watch from afar. But yeah, that's an issue, right? If you have that weak point on the inside of your line, and we saw Dylan Gabriel get a little bit of happy feet early on in the season, you'd like to get that squared away. It sounds like Marcus Harper will be okay in the next 2 or 3 weeks, but we'll see.
All right. Well, it's interesting as well, too, because the remaining part of this schedule and having that number 1 ranking, do you think that weighs a lot on Oregon coming down the stretch? And I was asking Joey, how important is that number 1 ranking when you know that if you're sitting at 1, you can lose the last game of the year and be fine for this playoff, versus if you're sitting at 8, 9, or 10 and you take one more loss at the end of the year?
It doesn't seem like the Dan Lanning era has been characterized by any performances. I mean, I guess you could point to the Washington State one where they won last second in Pullman, but otherwise they haven't really played down to an opponent. They got whooped on by Georgia, rightfully so. They couldn't figure out Washington and figure out zone with the corners that were healthy, and that was a tough team that made the national championship game. But by and large, it's not like they were, losing to Arizona randomly. By and large, they weren't losing to Stanford. What?
Second half of Arizona, second half of Oregon State.
And Oregon State.
Yes. No, that's totally fair. It's totally fair. But Bo Nix was on a leg, maybe, in that game.
But they were up 21, though, in the second half.
Yes. The defense wasn't good. It wasn't a great performance. You're totally right about that. But that was not a bad Oregon State team. That Oregon State team was not what Wisconsin or Maryland is in this moment. And so they didn't play down. They didn't play well. They didn't finish. I believe. I remember a couple of throws from Bo Nix that maybe 2 legs makes a difference. It would make a difference for me, and I'm barely an athlete.
Well, we appreciate you joining us, Dan, as always. When we come back, we'll talk about this Maryland matchup. Oregon favored by 25. Can they avoid the potential upset at home? We'll let you know when we come back on Talkin Ducks.
They've really opened up in the passing game, top 10 in the nation, as a passing team. They create a lot of explosive plays. Coach Loxley does an unbelievable job there on offense, and Coach Gaddis of creating some, advantageous, matchups when it comes to their RPO game and their ability to get the ball in space to those guys. So they're all threats for big plays. They're explosive play threats consistently, and their quarterback's delivering the ball really well to them right now.
Welcome back to Talkin Ducks. That was obviously head coach Dan Lanning as Oregon prepares to take on Maryland at home. The Ducks are 25-point favorites. We obviously burned a lot of clock with all of our wonderful guests, so we'll make it real quick here for this segment. Aaron, how does Oregon avoid an upset at home, and everyone talks about that hangover after all these big matchups. Now you come into a game where you're favored by 4 scores. How do they avoid things and just continue to keep this train rolling?
I can't fathom how they lose to this Maryland team. They're not very good. They have a good receiver in Ty Felton who's pretty good. Their quarterback's solid, but they just are not going to have the athletes. I mean, I had them having to commit at least three critical turnovers at Michigan. They lose that game. Same thing with Illinois. I think they got to commit 4 in this game to lose. I just don't see it. So just, take care of the football. Don't give away any cheap points. And they should have this game over by halftime.
Joey.
Are we doing score predictions? Because 56-13
No, we've got one more
pretty good
segment
to me.
for score predictions, my
You know,
friend.
like
This is how does Oregon avoid the upset?
Why? Why do we talk about that? Like,
I don't know. It feels. What would you like to talk about instead?
I don't know. I mean,
did you like the uniforms last week?
Some beautiful
Have you enjoyed
fall
this
colors
Generation
out
O
there.
uniform?
Like, no, I mean, this is honestly like this season feels like those years with Marcus, right? Where it's like you got 1 or 2 games on the schedule that it's like that is a legitimate, problem. But the others, all you have to do is go play smart football, which they're going to do. So there you go.
All right. Play smart.
However, in 2014, they were a big favorite against Arizona and lost, but that's because the offensive line was a mess and they made some key mistakes and let a pretty good team steal it, right? Maryland's not good enough.
Thank you.
That's all. Go ahead.
Thank you for your late counterpoint. I appreciate that, Aaron. All right, when we come back, we'll give you our score predictions. Ducks favored by 25. Welcome back to Talkin Ducks. We're back for one quick little segment to close up shop, and my voice is hanging in there by a thread. But Aaron, let's start with you. Oregon's favored by 25. Give me your score prediction and which Duck needs to have a great day in this matchup against Maryland.
Doesn't matter which Duck.
Nobody?
I'm just trying to find stuff to talk about in a game where they're favored by 25, my man.
Okay, they need to have. I can't think of one key to this game. Look, just show
I would say
up.
the replacement receiver for Tez Johnson. He's
Justice Lowe, right?
He doesn't
That
need
doesn't
to,
hurt.
though. Like, they can just go
He
2
doesn't
tight
need
ends
to,
the
but
entire
you would
game.
like to see him have one, right? Wouldn't that just give you a little bit more peace as far as replacing him if Johnson's out longer?
Sure, that'd be amazing, but they don't need that to happen to win this game. I thought that was the
Thank you
question.
for the content, Aaron. Give me a score prediction.
I have
Just give me
40.
a score prediction. I'm done with you.
Just basically saying there's nothing to
I'm
talk
done
about
with
in this
you.
game because the Ducks are going to roll 47-16.
I'm taking my
Okay,
microphone off.
47-16.
This is
Joey, what do you
ridiculous.
got?
What? I quit. Like, what are we talking about?
Your mic's falling off. You got a
I'm
chessboard with like
I already
half
gave
the
you my
pieces
score
in the corner of the
prediction.
room.
56-13. Go to commercial. We're done. See you next week. I love you
56-13.
guys.
Awesome. I got 47-20. I think Oregon rolls in this. 45-17. Let's
Who's the key for you? What has to
Key for me is whoever replaces Tez Johnson. I think if you're getting that start in this game as a player, regardless of how much you're favored by, this is your biggest game of the year because you're starting and you have a chance to prove something. If you can go out there and make plays, well, you're building some confidence. What if Tez Johnson isn't 100% in this title game? What if you play well the past 3 weeks? Coach is going to have confidence in you. Sure as heck needed a receiver in the national title game against Ohio State. That would have been nice. So that's my thought. That's just me.
Sounds like a guy who got in against Washington State and scored a big touchdown while he was developing. That's what that sounds like.
That's what, hey, listen, it helped. It was the spark that I needed. So, all right, that'll do it for this edition of Talkin Ducks. Thanks again to our wonderful crew. Obviously, Dan Rubenstein, George Reister, Aaron Fentress, Joey Harrington. Ducks favored by 25.
Wait, where's
Right,
Newman?
Tap it when we come back
Where's
next
Newman?
week. Newman, I don't know. Coach is something. We'll see
Probably
you
getting a
guys next week.
colonoscopy.